Hello, happy Wednesday, and welcome to today's AgileOps webinar, Use Contract Lifecycle Management to Save Headaches and Money with Compliance Requirements. It's part of the continuing AgileOps webinar series designed to help you understand contract lifecycle management, what it can mean for your legal department and the company as a whole, and how to move towards implementation of a solution. I'm Ellen Nendorf. I'm a founder of LPM Executive, where I work with corporate legal departments to establish and improve the legal operations function. This covers everything from process improvement to technology rollout and optimization to really help legal departments work most effectively with the resources available. Joining me today to talk about leveraging contract lifecycle management to support the business with regulatory compliance, among other big wins like efficiency, is Ellen Borowiak, Contracts Program Manager at St. Louis University. Ellen served as a project manager for the configuration and rollout of AgileOps in a diverse academic setting. Her responsibilities at St. Louis University also include negotiating university-wide business agreements, drafting and issuing requests for proposals, and cultivating and maintaining relationships with both university vendors and internal customers. Prior to her time at SLU, Ellen practiced real estate law at a large national law firm. And with a name like Ellen, I know she's got great insights to share. So welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so before we dive into the topic, just to our listeners, please feel free to ask questions as we move through the discussion today. There's a questions box on the right of your screen where you can enter those in. We will address them in real time as best we can, and we will also reserve 15 minutes after the webinar for questions as well. All right, so regulatory compliance. Probably maybe only the less dry topic other than data cleanup. But regardless, it is an important topic and you cannot get it wrong. And depending on your industry, it's a topic that can take up a good deal of time, effort, and energy. And I feel like you're either, scrolling through a long list of requirements and trying to decide if you've met them or not, or you may feel like you're buried under the weight of exploding paper everywhere to try to manage this process. So in our effort to kind of remove paper and the pain of regulatory compliance, we'll be focusing today on better ways to move forward. Before we dive too deeply, though, into actual compliance and how contract lifecycle management can help, Ellen, will you tell us just a little bit about your structure at SLU and how AgileOps is set up?
Yeah, so I think it's a good question because it kind of lays the foundation of what we did. So we're at a university. It's a large university that has, all of your traditional schools. There's 13 schools. There's a school of medicine, a school of law. But we also have about a 500 physician healthcare practice. And we have a large research arm. And so we're sort of diverse. We're very diverse in sort of the business lines, I'll say, that we have. It's a decentralized environment. So sort of if I think back 4 or 5 years ago, sort of the pre-AgileOps days, we didn't really know kind of a lot of the contracts that we did have. And so that was the environment that we adopted AgileOps and configured it. But it's a pretty diverse environment, and the system that we had to have needed to meet the requirements of all of those business units, so to speak.
And so then tell us a little bit about the AgileOps rollout, the roles and how that went.
Yeah, so our office, I'm in the business services office, and it's an office, sort of one of our roles is to sort of be a liaison between university departments and outside companies that the university does business with. So we had quite a bit of insight into whether it's contracts and sort of the various types of operations that the university had in that role as a liaison. So we were tapped, there was a need to have a contract management system, which I can touch on a little bit later. But and as soon as sort of that need was identified, university leadership started to sort of see what might be a natural fit for system administrators. And ultimately it landed in business services, I think just because we did have that knowledge about sort of the current practices, but also had some working knowledge of contracts, certainly my background, but even more than that, we're used to looking at contracts from a business perspective. And so business and finance was tapped. We do work closely with the Office of General Counsel, as well as a number of other departments on campus that are really teams within Agilent. So our compliance office, our information security, our export controls. We are the project managers, but it's a group effort, to be sure.
Yeah. And I think that's to be expected, especially given the wide reach of SLU and all the different departments to account for.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's fine. I was just going to say a little bit about what was driving the movement then to automating contract management.
Yeah, so I think had been some rumblings sort of amongst university administration for a while that we were, we are, like I said, we are fairly decentralized, and sometimes contracts that needed to be reviewed by some of those teams that I mentioned, they weren't necessarily getting those reviews. Communication from some of those offices maybe left a little to be desired, and so we really wanted to make sure that a contract needed to be reviewed was reviewed. Let's say by an export controls office if it's an international contract, maybe by our information security office if that contract has implications for university data. And so we wanted to make sure that that knowledge sort of rested in a system rather than an end user. We also wanted to provide some transparency. So prior to Agilent, the way that an end user might learn about the status of a contract review would be through emailing, myself, emailing someone in the Office of General Counsel. There was a lot of guesswork, frankly, for the end users. And so now what an end user can do is submit a contract, and they have some visibility to sort of see where that contract is in the review process, when the review process started. Sometimes there's a give and take between that end user and someone on the team, and there's visibility into that, which has been really helpful for our end user community. The system also has allowed us to mitigate risks. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure that contracts are reviewed by the appropriate teams. And so now we've set up various workflows in our system to make sure that that happens. We've also significantly streamlined the way that we authorize individuals to sign contracts. And university has adopted DocuSign along with Agilent to sort of make sure that contracts only go to those that are authorized signers, which for us has been huge, especially in a decentralized environment. There was really not a lot of visibility into that. And so that's been really helpful for us. Yeah, those are probably the biggest drivers. And I think as soon as university administration, like I said, there were some rumblings for a while. And then we did an RFP and got funded for it, which was great.
Yeah, fantastic. And I know you are not alone in just the e-signature piece being so critical, especially anyone that didn't have it prior to, let's say, March of 2020 was really scrambling to get that e-signature in place so that it just really completes the process digitally from end to end.
I've thought about that a lot since March. Between DocuSign and Agilent, like it really has allowed us to work remotely much more efficiently than we would have been pre-Agilent.
Yeah, it makes me, it's like what a time to have DocuSign,
Yes, exactly. And we do have, so since we access DocuSign through Agilent, and that's certainly one of the primary uses, but we have been able to use DocuSign for some other features, some other applications at the university, which has been helpful.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, so that's really helpful background, I think, for our listeners to understand, what you were facing. And when I think about regulatory compliance, it really all starts with getting a process in place to make sure that your compliance obligations are being met and followed. And so this is just a sample, I think, that we've got up here of a workflow, but I guess maybe just a little bit about what your workflow was before and what happened once you put it in Agiloft.
Yeah, so the workflow was really in the mind of the user, frankly. Some end users and some departments had a really well laid out process and in some instances, actually, there was one person that managed those contracts and everyone knew to go to that person. In other units and other departments, if someone was on leave for a few weeks, a contract might just be, signed by someone that potentially didn't have the authority to. And so there was really a lot of variation at the university in terms of what that workflow looked like. So what we did is early on in sort of our request to get funded and our request to sort of move this project forward, we met with a large group from the university stakeholders and really identified sort of the areas of risk, and I've mentioned many of them. Our information security team, our compliance office. As I mentioned, we do have a large healthcare practice, and so, particularly on the healthcare side, wanted to make sure that we were compliant. In addition to that, our compliance office, export controls, and then our legal office, risk management. So we identified those teams to sort of who might at some point need to touch contracts. We met with them in some cases. In other cases, they were on our configuration team and really worked through, and it was a very hands-on process in a lot of ways. There was regular meetings and to sort of talk through the type of contracts that they do see, the type of contracts that maybe they don't need to see, in what instances, maybe from what department even does, for instance, our information security team need to see something. Maybe if it's healthcare related, they do need to see it, but maybe if it's not healthcare related, they don't. And so we really got pretty granular in terms of what those teams needed to see, and then based on those requirements, we were able to sort of configure the system around that. The idea being that we wanted to create a system that for contracts that did have a large, maybe high risk or high dollar, maybe in the medical field, dealing with patient data or something like that, we wanted to make sure that any set of eyes that needed to be on them would get on them. But we also wanted to be mindful of some of those smaller contracts that maybe were fairly low dollar or low risk, and we wanted those to move through the system fairly quickly and fairly easily. And so we built a series of questions to sort of trigger the various reviews by those teams. It's a lot of information. Sorry.
That's very helpful. And I think, because of your diligence in having both the large scale and small scale workflows in the system, you can have everything in a system, which from a compliance perspective, be able to know, did you comply, or where are there holes, or what performance obligations do we have in certain scenarios. When everything is one place, that makes it all the easier.
Yeah, and that actually was really helpful in March. We had a couple of departments reach out to myself or to my colleague and say, hey, we know that we have some upcoming contracts that need to be canceled because all of a sudden students aren't on campus. Can you run this report for us so that we can get visibility into that? And that was just, something that certainly you don't think of when you're doing the RFP or even configuring the system, but the reporting and the ability to have one source has been incredibly helpful for us.
Yeah, and I think in our earlier conversation, Ellen, you mentioned that the edict is don't sign an agreement unless it's going through Agiloft.
That's right. Yeah, so we sort of approached the signature authority piece from both ends. We really did work with the end users in training to sort of make sure that end users understood how to use DocuSign, how to create that contract envelope, and really let them know, the people that were creating those envelopes, these are the people that can sign the contract. If they're not on this list, and the list is all populated with Agiloft and within Agiloft and varies based on, contract type, department, and dollar. If they're not on that list, then don't sign it outside or don't send it to anyone outside of the system. But the other side of that, which I think was also incredibly helpful, was working with the various vice presidents and deans that do have signature authority, making sure they were comfortable with the system. We created some guides for them to sort of let them know what to expect, what to look for. And they're now used to looking for sort of a little snapshot of the workflow history so that they can have some confidence that when they've signed, one of those contracts, that it's been through the standardized approval workflow that the university has all agreed upon. And so that has, I think it's made, DocuSign and AgileOpt have made our signing process easier, but it's also eliminated some of that guesswork for our end users and for those people that are signing contracts.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point too, because I do think where you're seeing, for departments or companies that are having trouble with signatures on contracts not happening very quickly, sometimes it's just because that signer is like, oh, I'm gonna have to look at this and I might have questions and I just don't know. Whereas when you're using a tool like AgileOpt, where it's been fully vetted and everyone who's need to see it has seen it and said it's okay, you can just sign, much more quickly with that confidence, and that is something that you also don't always think about when you're looking at tools.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of my colleagues who has been, who's just phenomenal, she's another system administrator, has really worked to make sure that that information is locked down. And so anytime a contract goes out for signature, it has certain information about the review path that contract's been on. And so it's been really helpful.
We've got just a few example questions. You had mentioned building out questions in the system to help, vet which way a contract needs to go. And so we've just got a couple of examples here too. But I know you had mentioned that this is a work in progress. It's something that you built in some questions, but that you continue to consider what other questions might be helpful.
Yeah, so we, like I said, we when configuring the system, we met with all of those teams, but compliance and it's certainly not static. And so, for example, I'm looking at this now, and I was on a meeting this morning with my colleague who's working with our compliance office to make sure that the university is checking for compliance with the GDPR, the European privacy laws that are fairly new. And so there's, in our dev system now, is our development site is a question related to that, and she's doing some testing, and we're going to be adding that into our system in the near future. So we are always sort of working with those teams to sort of understand what their needs are, what information they need to see, and then trying to figure out how we can build that into the system. So for these questions that are up here, if the answer to some of them is yes, let's say if it is an international vendor, our export controls team will receive that contract to approve. There are some other questions built into our system where, let's say if the question is yes, maybe they don't need to approve that contract, but they want to get a report of all of those contracts that have answered affirmatively. And so there's a couple different flavors that we've been able to structure it just to provide that visibility to those teams to make sure that we are being compliant with whatever concerns they have.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so really, I think the take-home point of this section is just standardize your process, both from a workflow perspective and then also the substance of what needs to be in there. And you can do that by having these teams reviewing consistently every contract that comes in. And once you've taken the time to automate this and ensured that it's followed every time, by having everything in one system and your VPs aren't signing anything they shouldn't, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time there's a contract. And then you land with fantastic reporting in the system. And I know you mentioned that the example in March, hey, what contracts do we need to cancel because the students have left? But I am sure there's many more use cases where this reporting's been helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned some of the intake questions that we have, that they will generate a report, let's say monthly to our compliance office. So we ask about, companies that our healthcare practice is doing business with, so that we can make sure those companies are getting the training they need if they get access to university patient data. And so there's all sorts of ways that we've been able to use this to sort of get it to, we now have that information that we didn't have. So we not only have standard practices and workflows now, but we're able to sort of quantify what type of business the university has in a way that we really couldn't pre-Agiloft.
And would you say that it's just a continuing learning process in terms of what else might be out there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that you know, the needs of the university will always be changing, and then the needs, you know, what we're responding to. So, you know, new regulations, new laws, those are always changing, and so one of our goals is to sort of always sort of keep the system flexible such that we can meet those needs. Another one of the goals is to really develop within our end users and our contract managers a group of people that are a little more savvy about contracts, that have some knowledge about what to look for, and so it's always evolving.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing people can forget too. You know, technology doesn't solve the problem with a one-time implementation, one size fits all, and you're good to go for the rest of it. It is it's a tool that you can use and will change and grow with your company, with your department, as those needs also evolve and as you learn a little bit more and people get more comfortable with how things are working.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if the system doesn't change, then, you know, either the university is not changing, and or there's no additional pressures, and I don't know that that's realistic from what I've seen.
I've yet to meet anyone where that's realistic, I think.
Yeah.
We have had a few questions come in though,
Sure.
Ellen. We'll jump to that. And for those of you listening, as you have other questions, please feel free to drop those in the questions box. But for the approvals and signature workflow and the changes that you made coming into Agiloft, how much of, I guess, that change management was handled by Agiloft and how much was handled by your team at the university to get those processes cleaned up?
Yeah, it's a good question, because we not only we configured the system and created those workflows within Agiloft, but then a lot of it was also trying to figure out what those workflows should be. So Agiloft really, they were patient with us as we answered some of those questions, but we certainly did reach out to them for guidance. You know, let's say a team wanted to get a report instead of be an improver. So our implementers were phenomenal in terms of letting us know what was feasible. It was great that so much was feasible from a systems perspective, because it really could support whatever needs that specific department had. So they were also really helpful in helping us understand just the various roles within the system that different people could have. We tried to some extent to standardize the system to a large extent in terms of reviews and workflows, but we also wanted to make sure that departments use the system, and so that involves some customization for each department about the various roles that people had. You know, and we wanted people that were used to touching contracts to use the system, and so Agiloft was really helpful in helping us understand the various roles that were possible within the system.
And I know that you mentioned you've got monthly reports that are going out to the different departments with some information to help keep them educated. But are you finding that they are also more proactive in going into Agiloft and looking for answers to questions for themselves?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we started, I'm trying to remember the dates, but we started our rollout of the system in the fall of 2018. And we're very intentional about doing sort of a long training process, just so that we could sort of, in some ways, hold people's hands and get them used to not only the system, but then the new process. And since that time, the number of questions that we've gotten about sort of reporting and whatnot has diminished quite a bit. One of the things that my colleague and I are working to do is sort of come up with a user guide on specifically on reporting, because I think that's, now, compared to a couple of years ago, we also have more data in the system, and so there's more to report on. But yeah, we're definitely seeing all of our contract managers and whatnot have the ability to go into the system and run reports for their contracts, and so we're seeing that quite a bit.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And has it helped? I'll say helps morale, but just I feel like when you empower people to be able to get the answers to their own questions and solve their own problems, it can really help out both from a promptness perspective and also just with overall engagement across the business.
Yeah, I think that's true. So that part of it has helped, that now people have a bit more control over their contracts in some ways. I think going hand in hand with that is just the visibility that they have during the contracting process, which they didn't have before. And so it's really empowering end users to manage their contracts, both in the sort of contracting process, and then once the contracts have been executed, and they're able to report off of them. So, change is never easy, and certainly there were a little bit of reticence, not necessarily to the system, but just to new processes. If you're used to walking a contract next door to your boss and having him or her sign off of it all the time, and a new process can be hard. But we really, I think that the tools that we've given those end users and the visibility and the management that they now have has really mitigated some of that.
Yeah, fantastic. We had another question come in, Ellen, around prior to implementing AgileLoft, how were you managing contracts, and have you been able to quantify the benefits of using AgileLoft?
Yeah, so we haven't quantified them, I would say, from a financial perspective. I think that's just, it's not a metric that we've really looked at. We have been looking at the number of contracts that were signed out of the system or signed by someone that they shouldn't have signed. And we've been able to sort of run some reports and provide some information to our leadership about that, about the various approvals that people are getting. So in some instances, it's been used to sort of say, hey, we're really busy. We need to hire someone new. Look at all of these contracts that we're reviewing. So we've been able to look at it at that level, but not from a financial perspective, really just because that's that wasn't one of the main drivers for us. And so it's not been sort of a question that leadership has had.
Yeah. When I'm just thinking through some of the things that you mentioned today, even in terms of being able to quantify that, just the time saved on, or getting information out to your end users where now they can go in and see what's going on. Just even the general email traffic of someone saying, hey, where's my contract? I submitted it, what's happening? All of those minutes add up. And I know that there are some great ROI calculators out there too, even on the AgileLoft website also, I believe, that can help do some of the more financial quantifying of benefits. But so much of it just depends on what was the business driver behind rolling out a system to what you need to showcase there.
Right.
A few more questions came in. One is, are the majority of contracts just reviewed, approved, and signed, or are terms negotiated? And if so, by whom?
Yeah, so terms are negotiated, and I would say it depends. So typically what happens is we have the various teams. Let's say it's a fairly complex contract, and there are a number of teams that need to review it. Let's say our compliance office and general counsel and information security. The functionality of AgileLoft allows us to have some lock edit functionality such that at the end of the review process for all of those teams, there's sort of one document with all of those edits made in there and comments in there. At that point, after those teams have all made their notes and their edits, there's a couple different things that could happen. Someone in the department, a business manager, let's say, could receive that and then work with the vendor on those changes. If maybe the changes, if maybe they're too legal in nature, or it's something that they're, for whatever reason, not comfortable negotiating, our Office of General Counsel will do that. And so I think it just depends primarily on the degree of risk, really, that you know, if it's something that's pretty risky, that from an institutional standpoint, we're not willing to move on. Often that's our general counsel's office that does that negotiating. If it's something that is, you know, we would really prefer the jurisdiction, let's say, be in Missouri instead of California, but that's not going to be a deal breaker, then that's something that's negotiated by our departments.
Fantastic. Well, Ellen, thank you so much for your expertise and experience that you shared today, and for those questions we had coming through. We are going to wrap it up for today, but if there are other thoughts or questions from our listeners, please feel free to reach out to Agiloft and ask those questions, and we'd be happy to get answers back to you. So Ellen, thanks again today, and everyone have a fantastic afternoon.
Thanks so much.